I think our community feels more vulnerable than it has in a long time. This is on top of, right, before this past fall, there were record levels of anti-Semitism already in our country, the highest in almost 40 years. And when you take that and then you put on top of it this incredible rise in anti-Semitic ideas, attitudes, actions, incidents across almost every sphere in our society and in our community, it just creates an incredible need for people to feel supported, safe, and secure.
That's Max Patashnik, Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of Greater Seattle, a network of 35 local Jewish organizations that work together to advocate for the Jewish community, to build bridges of understanding with other communities, and to break down polarization throughout our society. I'm Jeff Schwager, and you're listening to Confronting Hate Together, a series of podcasts that is part of a multimedia exhibit created through a unique partnership of the Black Heritage Society of Washington State, the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, and the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience. In each episode, you'll hear from leaders of the Black, Jewish, and Asian communities about the challenges they face confronting hate and the work they do in their individual communities and together to combat the hate, bias, and discrimination we all see in the state of Washington and the world today. We'll hear more from Max Patashnik later in today's program, along with other leaders of the local Jewish community. In future episodes, we'll hear from leaders of the African American and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities as we explore how we're all confronting hate together. Dee Simon is the Chief Executive Officer of Seattle's Holocaust Center for Humanity. For the past 18 years, Dee has been one of our region's most powerful voices, speaking out about the horrors of the Holocaust and the many examples, past and present, of genocide throughout the world. Dee's retirement from the Holocaust Center in the summer of 2024 allows her the opportunity to reflect on her life's work fighting against the most pernicious examples of hate and discrimination in our world.
One of the greatest tools we have in the tool shed for fighting hate is education. And so the Holocaust's primary focus is to work with teachers and students, work with them to sort of understand the consequences of hate, what happened in the Holocaust, understand that human atrocities and genocide is not inevitable, that it's preventable, and what are the signs, what are the signals. It starts from everyday discrimination and dehumanization, and then how can we in our everyday lives stop that base from building so you don't get to the top of the pyramid, which is genocide. So I think that through education in schools, that's one of the main focuses of our work. I also think that one of the things we understand is that people don't necessarily learn by learning dates and numbers and facts. What they sometimes learn, what sometimes really resonates, is storytelling. It's a way of connecting people to empathy.
With this in mind, groups like the Holocaust Center and the Washington State Jewish Historical Society collect and share oral histories of Holocaust survivors with students throughout the state of Washington.
Those stories are the wealth that we have today that we can build on and create this encyclopedia, if you will, of stories for future generations, and not only Jewish children, but especially non-Jewish children, to learn about Jewish culture and Jewish identity, and even just to teach them that certain aspects in the world, like discrimination, and bullying, and scapegoating, and stereotyping, are universal. They don't apply to one race or one culture. They apply to everyone. And how can we fight that?
One way the Holocaust Center has strived to fight bias across all communities in Washington state is a program they began in 2016 with the Anti-Defamation League to educate law enforcement on the dangers of police discrimination. Through their joint police training program, they spoke to more than 800 police officers in 2023, and they have a contract with the statewide training commission to educate all 11,000 Washington state police officers in the coming years.
The major goal of the program is to really train police officers to be responsible for their actions, individual responsibility every day when they're on the job. And the in-person training is about 4 hours. And it really goes through educating them about how policemen during Nazi Germany went down that slippery slope and went from protecting their citizens to killing them. And then we talk about what eventually we talk about today and current events and what the community thinks about policing. And then in the end, we ask them what will prevent them from going down that slippery slope. And they mention, things like, well, we have a constitution and we have good training and we have the latest equipment and we have a diverse police force. And we sort of tell them, well, in Nazi Germany, they had the constitution, they had the latest equipment, they had what they thought was a diverse police force, they had excellent training. So no, that's not it. And eventually they kind of come to understand that really what will prevent them from going down that slippery slope is if they as individuals treat everyone equally all of the time. When they're working, everyone needs to be treated the same. And that's how they'll actually prevent themselves from ever going down a slippery slope.
Miri Cypers is the Northwest Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League, the 110-year-old civil rights organization dedicated to fighting anti-Semitism and extremism against all communities. Miri came to the ADL from Giffords. That nonprofit was established by former Congresswoman Gabby Giffords to battle gun violence after she was shot in the head and left partially paralyzed by a mentally ill constituent at a public event. Here in Seattle, the shooting at the Jewish Federation on July 28, 2006, by an extremist bent on killing Jews because he was angry with Israel, has served as a ready reminder of the dangers of extremism mixed with guns. Miri has a lot to say about the intersection between discrimination, hate, and gun violence.
While I was working for Giffords and certainly now at ADL, the toxic mix of gun violence and hate is one that can be tremendously lethal for different communities, whether it's a Sikh community in the United States or an LGBTQ community or a Black community in Charleston or the Jewish community in Pittsburgh or even Seattle. Guns and hate are a very, very toxic mix. And I'm actually really proud of some of the work we've done here in Washington State, where due to the shooting at the Jewish Federation, the Jewish community has really stood up and has led tremendous efforts to pass background checks and a number of other reforms here in Washington State, and been a really important voice for showing how gun violence prevention can be very lethal when it comes to targeting different communities with hateful ideology.
The ADL, of course, is no stranger to hateful ideology. For more than a century, the organization has led the fight against hate wherever it rears its head.
I think our understanding is that hate is a really complex issue that's been around for millennia, and there's no one single solution or silver bullet that's going to fight the problem of anti-Semitism or racism or prejudice, etc. So I think at ADL, what we really try to do is have a holistic theory of change where we recognize that it has to be a comprehensive approach to a big problem. And at a local level, what we really do on our team in the Pacific Northwest and our local offices do across the US is have that holistic approach and implement it. So the kinds of work that we do on a day-to-day basis are education in schools, especially in K through 12 spaces, where we unfortunately see bias and bullying emerge from a young age. And we know that we need to equip students and educators with the tools to tackle bias and bullying, but also create schools where people feel a sense of belonging. We also are increasingly focusing on how we work more proactively with campuses to be able to respond to incidents that take place, but be able to also provide administrators and student leaders with the kind of education that they need to understand the Jewish community and our identity and how anti-Semitism is manifesting right now. That really goes hand in hand with a lot of the work that we do with law enforcement. We do a lot of professional development, sharing of information, relationship building, so that we can ensure that law enforcement can be there for minority communities and can understand some of the challenges that we face on the ground.
Like most people in minority communities, Miri herself has had to deal with differing forms of bias, othering, and even the very real threat of violence.
I was actually targeted by extremist neo-Nazis because of my work at ADL several years ago. And I was very fortunate to have the support of law enforcement who did a very thorough investigation and ended up finding several people across the United States who were targeting people like me who care about civil rights and do a lot of work to fight hate. And they ended up arresting these individuals. But because Washington had passed such groundbreaking laws that actually allowed us to disarm extremists who had firearms and who were spewing threatening and harassing behavior, they were actually able to disarm the individual in particular who was threatening me and my family in Washington. So I take these kinds of policy issues personally because they are personal to me. And I think they're really personal to members of the Jewish community. And unfortunately, I think what we've only seen in Washington state is that the security needs of all of our communities has really grown. And we worked really hard with the Federation to pass $500,000 in Olympia last year to make sure that more funds are being dispersed to different nonprofits across the state, not only in Congress, but actually here in our state as well. And what we heard is that in 2023, they actually got 117 applications from different groups that really are looking for funding and protection and security. So unfortunately, I do think this is a growing trend. And I think it's an unfortunate way where the Jewish community, I think, can really have a voice in exercising leadership and talking about how hate and violence can be very toxic. And it's an area where we really need policymakers and communities to step up and take it seriously.
The Jewish Federation's Max Patashnik, who we heard from at the top of this episode, has also seen how increased anti-Semitism has led to insecurity in the Jewish community, feeling she herself is not immune to when it comes to her own family's safety in public spaces.
The American Jewish Committee came out with their annual survey of kind of the state of anti-Semitism in the U.S. And, 2/3 of Jews feel less safe than they did a year ago. And almost half of Jews in the last year altered their behavior out of fear of anti-Semitism. And I'll give you, just like a tiny example. Mid-October, my family was going to Tucson for a family wedding. And on a work trip to Israel a few years ago, I got my daughter, she's 4 now, this t-shirt that has animals and the Hebrew alphabet on it. And she said that was the outfit that she wanted to pick out the day we were traveling. And I said, I didn't say why to her, she's too young, but I just said, no, we're not going to wear that right now. And that was a conscious change in behavior. My family decided not to put out Hanukkah decorations this year, which in and of itself is not a big loss, like externally in our house, but it was something we did consciously out of fear of what might happen. And whether it's, a Jewish student hiding their identity in public school or a Jewish employee not feeling safe to talk about who they are, I think that's one of the things that we're really seeing and creates this culture and climate of fear for Jews in the U.S.
Max views the current spike in anti-Semitism as part of an ongoing pattern.
Historically, we've seen that anti-Semitism really works in a cyclical nature. And time again, throughout the history of our people, the Jewish community have experienced moments, periods of calm, of safety, and that unfortunately, time and time again, that has been punctuated by a really big rise in anti-Semitic ideas and attitudes, and then hopefully a fall again. And when you look at societies where democracy is really under threat, that's one of the things that really demonstrates a rise in anti-Semitism. I think a lot of times people don't understand how anti-Semitism works or what it looks like. A lot of people think of anti-Semitism as anti-Judaism, not anti-Jew. But the reality is that Jews aren't victim to anti-Semitism typically today because of the way we pray, because of what's in the Torah, right? Jews are typically victim of blind spots or biases or bigotry as kind of the escalating building blocks of hate because of what people believe we are responsible for, right? If you take the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, it was really that the shooter believed that Jews were responsible for the replacement theory, the theory that folks who are immigrants, refugees, asylees, people of color are coming in and taking the jobs of white people in this country, and that Jews are orchestrating that and responsible for that. And so that's why that attack happened. And synagogues are just a reliable place to find Jews. So you put in whatever conspiracy theory you might find, and people can find a way to make sure that Jews are to blame for it. And that's one of the things I think you see across the spectrum, where Jews can be blamed for both being socialists and the orchestrators of capitalism. Like, how is, the things that are in total opposite ends of the spectrum, you see that happening.
Historically, the Jewish community has recognized that anti-Semitism doesn't exist in a vacuum. That where there's anti-Semitism, there is also anti-Asian and anti-Black discrimination. And where there's anti-Jewish sentiment, there is also likely to be bias against other minority religions. Macs in the Jewish Federation see it as their job to speak up wherever they see discrimination and injustice.
We've been advocating in Olympia for almost 25 years now to support the Jewish community and support Jewish agencies. And what we see is that usually things that impact the Jewish community are not impacting the Jewish community alone, whether that is a need for strengthening our social safety net, so that whether somebody is Jewish or whether they are, part of the African American community, or they're Sikh or whatever that is, and they are struggling with food security or affordable rent, like, those are things that are universal, and we need to understand that they impact. Someone might not call them like the most important issue for the Jewish community, but the truth is that they impact members of the Jewish community and impact beyond. So finding the areas where we have common cause and common goal and uniting around that work to create safety and well-being. I can't remember who said this quote, but it's like, well-being is not just, or safety is not just the absence of violence. Safety is the presence of well-being, and what does well-being look like for other communities and our community? And there are a lot of similarities there. In the past, we've led on efforts to strengthen Washington State's hate crimes law, and that's something that's been a strong area of collaboration with other groups and other communities. We have joined several years ago. There's a group called the Racial Equity Team down in Olympia, and it's a group of organizations and groups working together to advance policies that work toward more equitable policies and systems in our state. I also look at some of the work, Jeff, that we have to do internally when we talk about the African American community and the Asian American community. It's also important to acknowledge that the Jewish community is a multi-ethnic, multiracial community, and we have to do our own work internally to ensure that we're creating welcoming and inclusive spaces for everybody who's part of our community, and trying to work to make sure that our leadership and our internal work matches veracity and the strength and the efforts of the external work we need to do together to build support and allyship with other groups. I also know that I think the Anti-Defamation League has been really the lead on this, but we've been grateful to be a core part of the Asian Jewish initiative that was created about 18 months ago. And that's been a really beautiful place to build understanding and support of collective struggles and also collective liberation, and what does that look like. And so I also think another piece is learning about what the experiences of other communities are, learning about their narratives, knowing that we are all struggling with distinct challenges, and yet finding the areas where we can unite around, solutions and efforts that can make change together, and honoring where there might be different solutions and being willing and vulnerable to support those as well.
Rabbi Daniel Weiner is the senior rabbi at Temple Dehersh Sinai in Seattle and Bellevue, the largest Reform congregation in the Pacific Northwest. He teaches and lectures frequently and founded the Center for Religious Wisdom and World Affairs at Seattle University. He is also the author of Good God, Faith for the Rest of Us, about the societal gulf between faith and secularism. His columns have appeared in the Seattle Times, The Forward, and Haaretz. Throughout his tenure at Temple Dehersh Sinai, he has experienced acts of vandalism, but in recent years the problem has grown more extreme, the sentiments expressed more hateful, often implicitly blaming the Jews of Seattle for events in the Middle East.
So we've had two more dramatic instances of vandalism over the last number of years, one in 2017 and one just last April, almost a year ago, April. And I think even prior to October 7th, that, certainly stirred within our community a feeling of some anxiety, some vulnerability that even in azure blue Seattle, There are those whose contempt for Israel, and by extension contempt for the Jewish people, is such that they will go out of their way to not only express their toxicity publicly, but to do so in a way that defaces sacred architecture, that defaces a synagogue. While it was certainly troubling and disillusioning in some levels, there was, particularly the first time around, when it was more focused on Holocaust denial and not so much on Israel, there was a quote-unquote silver lining to the extent that there was such an incredible outpouring of support from all across the community, affirming for us that that these sentiments and this act of vandalism was an anomaly, represented a very fringe minority view, and that most people wanted to affirm for us that they stood with us, that they stood with the Jewish people, that they stood with a very different take on America and the and respect for and defense of the various communities, particularly minority communities within.
For Rabbi Weiner, one of the keys to maintaining security for the Jewish community and confronting hate against it is building strong bonds with other communities. In particular, he sees a strong bond between the Jewish and Black communities that goes back to the history of Jewish allyship with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
I and Temple and others within the community have, really forged years-long relationship with folks in the Black community, and it's been complicated going back to civil rights and before. There were so many things that we share between our two communities. Historic marginalization, a theology of liberation. These are things that make us kind of ready and obvious allies. And I think that those alliances have been incredibly productive.
That mutual relationship between Jews and African Americans also means standing side by side with the Black community in their times of trouble. Whether it's when the local Black community was the victim of redlining, that is, illegal discrimination in housing, or when a Black church is attacked, or an unarmed Black man is killed by police.
We reach out, for example, when things happen more when Mother Emanuel was shot up, when there have been, during the George Floyd protests and kind of the consciousness raising around police brutality, and the Jewish community has really gone out of its way to express support and to stand with the Black community in whatever way was appropriate and in whatever way we could. I think, locally, for example, I know that, Temple Deher Sinai, historically was very involved in pushing back against redlining in our Capitol Hill Central District area. And one of the great senses of pride that Temple has in terms of its history is when Dr. King came here in 1962, and very few churches, even Black churches, would have him preach there because he was controversial. We tend to forget he's like this sainted figure now, but he was quite controversial in his era. Temple provided a platform for him because of our convictions to support the Black community in that way. And this goes back Temple and Mount Zion, and now Temple and First AME, have developed and deepened these relationships and these bonds. Again, to be there for one another at a time of crisis or need, but more importantly, to forge an ongoing relationship of trust and fellowship and connection that hopefully provides opportunities for positive interactions and not merely, responses to crisis.
That relationship goes both ways, as when the Black community and the Asian community as well stand side by side with the Jewish community when sacred Jewish spaces are defaced by vandals. This has happened more than once at Temple Deher Sinai, and members of the Black and Asian communities have stood alongside their Jewish neighbors. In April 2023, the temple was vandalized with Holocaust-denying graffiti. Initially, Rabbi Weiner chose to leave the graffiti in place as a stark reminder that anti-Jewish hate is still a threat, even in liberal 21st century Seattle. But eventually, he found a unique way to restore the beauty of the temple.
One of the ways in which we dealt with both elements of graffiti and vandalism, but particularly this time around, is we've brought together young people, young artists from Bush School, from Seattle Academy, and from Wing Luke, who are helping us to re-sanctify the sacred space that was marred with graffiti with art of hope and redemption, both as a way of demonstrating how the community is coming together to, as I said, to kind of re-sanctify this space, but also the fact that young people are involved, I think, is a wonderful, affirming sense of hope and promise for the future.
Young people, hope, and a promise for the future. Surely that is the best way to fight against hate in the 21st century. For the Black Heritage Society of Washington State, the Washington State Jewish Historical Society, and the Wing Luke Museum of the Asian Pacific American Experience, I am Jeff Schwager, and we are confronting hate together. Special thanks to our lead project sponsor, the Seattle Department of Neighborhoods, and our major sponsors, the For Culture Heritage Project and the National Park Foundation. We would also like to thank the Rita and Herbert Rosen Foundation for their grant in support of Jewish history, John and Bobby Bridge, the Aaronsburg family, and the Washington State Historical Society for their Diversity and Local History Internship Grant. This program was written and produced by Jeff Schwager and edited and engineered by Kamna Shastri. Additional assistance was provided by our interns, Shania Black and Daniel Sauter. Executive producers, Cassie Chin, Stephanie Johnson-Tolliver, and Lisa Kranzler.